Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Marble Palace, Post Media's Ledge video podcast. I am Murray Mandryk, political columnist for the Regina Leader Post and Star Phoenix. Joining me as usual, Arthur White-Crummey, our legislative reporter for the newspapers, and our special guest this week, a young lady I've wanting to get on here for a long time, Lisa Schick, senior reporter for CJME, who covers the Ledge, who covers the weekly and bi-weekly calls on COVID-19 religiously and effectively. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. Arthur, we're going to start with you, and specifically a story that you wrote that I think is of interest because it seems to suggest a bit of a shift at the legislature from nothing but constant COVID coverage to something else, which in this day and age is now considered news, because when we're actually not covering COVID. Tell me, exactly, tell me what's going on in terms of what you heard and saw in the legislature yesterday, and maybe how that relates to whatever level of success Premier Scott Moe, Health Minister Paul Merriman, and others might be having in selling their COVID message, which largely centers around the success of the vaccine campaign.
Yeah, it's hard to extrapolate by just a few days, but this week, Ryan Miley and the NDP seem to have eased off of the constant COVID-19 criticism during question period about the government response. These past 2 days, they've led with other issues during question period. So on Monday, they began with overdoses, and yesterday, Tuesday, they began talking about SASFIR's procurement, which is a very familiar issue for them, but one that hasn't really been a priority when we were in the middle of a surge of COVID-19 cases and hospitals were filling up. That's no longer really the case anymore. The numbers are looking more encouraging. And when we asked Ryan Miley about this apparent shift, he said you're going to continue to hear him pressing Premier Moe about his record. He's going to have 3 hours to do that today on Wednesday during Premier's estimates, but he's beginning to look forward towards the post-COVID future. And that's going to be largely about jobs. It's going to be about the recovery. And clearly the NDP has very different priorities in that regard than the Saskatchewan Party. But at the same time, whenever Ryan Miley has been pressing the Premier about his COVID-19 record and COVID-19 issues over the past week and a half or so, even before this apparent shift, the Premier had a very easy time just turning the tables and talking about his reopening plan and the success of the vaccine strategy. And I think the reopening plan does seem to be getting fairly positive reviews, except perhaps from the Prime Minister, which of course is only a positive as far as the Premier is concerned, I'm sure.
That's true.
So based on what I'm seeing on social media and in the limited interactions that I'm having in my social life, most people seem to be pretty eager about this plan, about its simplicity, about the fact that it does seem to offer encouragement to people to get vaccinated, and about, I guess, the sense of optimism that it's sort of offering people after this very long, dark period that we've all lived through.
Well, that's interesting, and I want to talk to Lisa about shifts, because I honestly think you probably have been on more COVID calls than anybody, Lisa. I think you and Mo are the one consistent, although I think you're more consistent than Mo. What did you hear this week that you might have not heard before in terms of either content or tone? And I guess what I'm speaking of is I thought there was sort of more technical questions that we haven't heard in a while as to how the vaccine is going to roll out, how AstraZeneca is going to be replaced now that they're not getting other stuff or first dose AstraZeneca shots, which suggests to me a really interesting change in how people are relating, how government's relating to the whole COVID strategy. Is that my fertile imagination, or was there something different that I was hearing this week on the call compared with others?
Hey, well, this week there were a lot of kind of smaller things. There wasn't really an overarching theme for the whole call that everybody was asking about, so you did get a lot of those kind of different questions. Certainly, the question about second doses for AstraZeneca was an important one for a lot of people. And I think this week was the first time that you heard government really confirm that they are looking at Pfizer vaccines for the second dose. They had been saying, we're considering this, we're watching studies, but yesterday we heard kind of a definitive, if we don't get the AstraZeneca doses we need, we're going to use Pfizer. And certainly there were questions about the efficacy of the vaccine so far, which does get a little bit technical in some of the numbers. And Shahab did say that it's about 99% effective so far, which is good news. And there were other specific things. I know the Premier talked about NACI, the National Advisory Board for Immunizations, and, some of his concerns. He said before that he wants them to be more clear in what they're saying, but I think his wording was a little bit stronger yesterday in wanting them to be more clear. And, he said with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we still don't really have an answer on that, but Saskatchewan is almost past when we can use that because we're past the 30-year mark and it's only approved to about 30 years old.
I think you make a really interesting point related to the overarching themes, because every time there is an overarching theme, what happens is it's because there's a crisis or a situation that really that really requires, I guess, government to explain or step out. I think what's happening differently is we are seeing case numbers down, Lisa. And I guess what I'm kind of curious about is whether you thought that was sort of reflected in some of the things being posed to the Premier, because it's been a while since we've actually sort of seen cases slide significantly, even though the government always says, well, they're down a little, they're down a little. I think the notion this week that we saw Saskatoon surpass Regina in active cases and other things came as a bit of a relief to the Premier and Dr. Shahab. What can you say, or what did they tell us yesterday about the case numbers that you found interesting?
Yeah, every time we talk about case numbers, and for the last little while, they have been kind of slowly going down. They talk about, the measures are working. People are doing what they need to keep those case numbers down. And the Premier always talks about vaccines working, that, we're getting more and more people vaccinated. Those are working as well. And, they're talking about cases going down as they're expecting, again, because of those vaccines, because of the measures, and they're hoping that those things continue.
What happens now in the legislature, Arthur, although there's only going to be a day or two left because we're nearing the end of the session, but as you suggested earlier, if the opposition can't continue its narrative about there being a crisis related to those case numbers because they're going down, how far back can they basically go and say, you messed up this whole process in the second wave and the third wave, we could have done better? I guess what I'm asking is, what kind of appetite do you think there will be from the public, especially, to have a really good review, a really good analysis of what did or didn't go right during the COVID-19 crisis once it's over? And is the very fact that we can actually speak in terms of the COVID-19 crisis perhaps being over change the whole dialogue in itself?
Yeah, I think it has to. I don't think we're going to see the NDP take the pressure off about the past record. I think we're going to continue to hear a lot about avoidable deaths, about the crisis in long-term care, about the lessons that we can draw from the pandemic going forward, in terms of preparation for the next crisis, in terms of better funding, better staffing within the healthcare system. All of that remains extremely relevant. And I don't think it's going anywhere. But that being said, I do ask, like you seem to be hinting, Murray, perhaps, how much appetite there's going to be from the public to continue to pick at those scabs, as it were, when I think people really just want to move forward and I guess look towards a brighter future as we return to normality. How quickly that happens is still open to question. But if things continue to move according to the Premier's vaccination plan, and we really do get a two-dose summer that brings us back to a semblance of normality. I think the premier is going to get quite pretty forceful political tailwinds from that. That's going to leave him sailing close to the top of his popularity ratings into the future.
I'm going to ask you this, Lisa, because I always like asking different reporters, because people don't get we have different experiences in terms of how the public reacts to our stories, because we do different stories, and sometimes we have different publics paying attention to stories at any given time. But I guess, do you sense a change in the public mood, and as per what Arthur is suggesting, maybe less of a mood for bad news COVID stories when things seems to be getting better because of vaccines? Are you sensing that a little bit in terms of the feedback that you're getting now that more and more people are getting vaccines? I see a lot of posts on social media where people are really, really excited about it because I guess maybe younger people are getting vaccinated. They're a little bit more active on social media, but I'm sensing a little bit of a change in that regard. Is that your experience too? Or?
Yeah, well, it seems like people certainly are more optimistic about things. I mean, like you say, more people are getting vaccinated. They're excited about that. They're feeling more optimistic, especially since the reopen plan opened. They actually have kind of a timeline when they can start getting to do the things that they used to do. And you see that in comments, in people talking about these things online, and they like that. They're not, through this whole thing, there hasn't been much of an appetite from what I'm seeing for bad news. There have been a lot of people saying, oh, we don't want to hear this kind of thing. I mean, you kind of have to report on it, but it's definitely more optimistic in what I'm seeing. There's still going to be that kind of contingent of people who they aren't going to be happy with any of these things because they're just not happy that any of the COVID things have happened. They're not happy with restrictions. They're not happy having to wear masks. But yeah, definitely more optimistic, a bit of a brighter conversations maybe around this these days.
If I could just chime in for a second, Murray,
yeah.
I think that there was a key point close to the end of the press conference yesterday where I really think the premier did a good job at I think channeling the public mood, such as I detected, and that's where he was sort of it was after he had expressed his reservations about what the Prime Minister said, with the added caution, with urging for provinces to wait until cases are really quite low before beginning their reopening. And the Premier said, we are going to go back to normal. It was extremely insistent. We've heard from time to time speculation within the media from some public health experts that we're going to be living with COVID for a long time and that it's going to continue to change our life. But I don't think that's what people want to hear. And I think what the premier said in that extremely forceful way, I think is going to get a lot of resonance.
I think that's an excellent point, because what I took from that is it wasn't usually done with the political overtones that he sometimes says these things to be a bit of a shot at Trudeau and everything else. I took it to mean in the same way you did, in the really positive tones of, here's some good news that we're finally having. And I guess to you, Arthur, has that changed, or might that turn around what I thought was an increasingly difficult session for the Sask Party government at times, because when the numbers were bad, and they were less bad when the session started, but there was certainly the hangover from the third wave going into it, the government was taking a fair bit of a beating early on in the session, and that wasn't a pretty budget that we saw with a deficit that's going to be over $2.5 billion, largest we've ever seen. The government was, I think, feeling it early on in the session in terms of the pressures, both with the numbers, with what was going on financially in the province, and maybe the jobs thing. Then along came a few things like the canola crushing and a few others that seemed to turn around things, and now the vaccination COVID numbers. So is it possible that the government might be salvaging something out of what would have otherwise been a very bad session for them and a pretty good one for the opposition?
Absolutely, I agree entirely. The NDP had a lot of ammunition through the first two-thirds or so of the session. First, as you said, they had the budget, and then there was job numbers that were fairly disappointing in comparison to some of the previous reports. Also, of course, the third wave. Ryan Miley was quite effective around the middle of the session, where he was really pressing Mo on the ICU visit. I think he got a lot of traction off of that. ICUs were struggling. They were double bunking people. Ryan Miley was pressing the premier, why won't you visit? ICU doctors want you to visit. And it really seemed, as I said in the past, that the premier was sort of backed into a corner there. But things changed very quickly. And yes, the canola crushing plants gave them an early response to some of the job.
It.
Yeah, they crushed it on
the
job numbers and sort of took the wind out of the NDP sails on the economy. And then we got a really positive labor force survey just a few days later that put Saskatchewan back into the lead, tied with Quebec for lowest unemployment rate in the country. So that also gave Jeremy Harrison a really easy retort to some of Alina Young's often humorous attacks against the Sask Party. And then the plan, I think, was just really the final coup de grace for the Sask Party, where they were able to completely retake control of the narrative. And you really didn't hear the NDP criticizing it with quite the same forcefulness that they had criticized some other elements of the Sask Party response to COVID. You did hear Ryan Miley saying it should have included more metrics, that it should have taken account of case rates and hospitalizations. But I don't think that that's going to resonate with the public unless we see another crisis, unless we see overflowing ICUs in the next few weeks. And so far, there's no sign that's going to happen.
Did you sense the same thing, Lisa? Because there is an ebb and flow in terms of anytime you're covering any issue, particularly when you're covering a repeated issue like COVID. And we've had some very bad moments in the last year in terms of COVID-19. And I would suspect the third wave has represented some of the worst because of the ICU problem. And certainly earlier on when we were seeing all those deaths in January. But I wonder if the government was a little bit ahead of the public mood here, as governments tend to be when they want to be ahead of the public in terms of selling optimism. Is the public kind of sort of catching up with the government in terms of the reaction that you are now seeing and saw during the session, Lisa?
Yeah, the government this whole time has been very optimistic themselves. They've been saying, things might look bad in these numbers, but if we keep going, we're going to do better, and kind of pushing in that way. And now we are doing better. We're seeing better numbers. There is a reopen plan now, and a possibility of that coming in fairly short order. And people are catching on to that, and they are getting that optimism, and they're kind of getting there saying, we are doing better. What we've been doing has been working.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny. Everybody thinks that reporters are just ghouls that love bad news. That's columnists. I just want to be clear about that. That's strictly columnists. Reporters are completely objective in terms of this. But what we wind up delivering is quite different quite often. And I've seen few sessions where there's been this kind of change in flow. Probably later on. Sometimes budgets or something big comes along and changes it. But in this particular case, it does possibly look like the government might have turned it around. Although, as we leave here, Arthur, just one thought. I thought it was a pretty good session for the NDP in a lot of areas. What did you see as the fun exchanges, and who do you think did particularly well in government and did particularly well in opposition, or who struggled more?
Sure. I mean, I'm a bit hesitant to give reviews, but I think in some cases it's kind of obvious that there were sort of two NDP members above all that I think had their breakout sessions. One is Alina Young. This has been talking about before. You've written about it, Murray, where she's really at times seemed to get under Jeremy Harrison's skin, which is has led to some pretty interesting exchanges, some pretty fiery exchanges. She hasn't always gotten the best of him. You and I have disagreed over a few things there, but often she has had some very, very memorable attack lines that I think really stood out for the NDP. The other one I think is actually Mira Conway. It's sometimes been issues that were sort of behind the scenes that we weren't really expecting to jump out. But she's been really passionate about some of the issues that I think that she's been advocating for,
like daycare and things like that. Yeah,
daycare. Another one was a particular constituent of hers who was not able to get her son, infant son who was born in Saskatchewan, a health card because of what seemed to be just a bureaucratic, morass. She had repeatedly tried to reach out to the health minister in that regard, and I think that she was very, very effective in showing herself as a solid advocate for her constituents, which is half the battle of getting reelected. But not that that's going to be a problem in Regina Elphinstone Centre.
I don't think so. Do you sense probably not? Do you sense the same thing a little bit, Lisa, in terms of nobody was much talking about the NDP after an election in which they wound up with the same number of seats they had going into the election. But as Arthur suggested, there's at least a couple members where they seem to be talking a little bit more of. And I thought even Brian Miley was a little stronger on a lot of days, certainly not scared to take on government. As we close this off, did you see a bit of difference in terms of what Brian Miley was presenting as an opposition leader compared with maybe what we saw during the election or during last year's spring sitting or a fall sitting in November?
Well, what really struck me this spring is that the rhetoric coming up from the NDP in the House was a lot sharper.
Yes.
Taking a lot of, I don't want to say personal attacks, but kind of going after some of the ministers a little bit more. Ryan Miley going after the premier with sharper language. I know Ryan Miley said a few times, both in and out of the House, talking about Paul Merriman, the health minister, his experience on other files, and saying, well, he did not do a very good job on these other files, so why would they have ever given him the health file? And certainly they haven't really backed down on that. They've kept going, and they've kept going very hard through most of the session.
Yeah, and it was. We could talk about this likely all day, but unfortunately we're out of time right now. Lisa, Arthur, thank you so much for your time. It was a great conversation, and we'll hopefully see you sometime soon inside the Marble Palace.
Thanks so much.